Hi, and welcome to Prune Your Branches, Writing Choices Within a Limited Scope. I'm Felix, or Izombo on most online platforms, and in this talk I would like to share some experiences and techniques to make your game story feel more dynamic without exponentially increasing your workload. Before I start, a little about me and why I'm giving this talk. I'm primarily a writer and narrative designer, but I also do programming, among other things. For the past 8 years, that was mainly as part of the indie duo Boys Love Plus, or BL Plus for short, along with my longtime friend and collaborator Rohan, also known as Pectin. So in our projects, they've all been a colorful mix of genres and narrative ideas that we wanted to explore. And with all of them, it's been a balancing act of following what we found interesting while keeping it at a scope that we could manage as a two-person team. And since I was the one doing most of the writing, narrative design, and programming, I got to experience this tension from the initial outline to the final implemented dialogues. So I would like to share some experiences that I made with that. Let's start by talking about branching in general. Even if you're just starting out writing interactive stories, you have likely seen a diagram like this. It's usually just an abstracted representation of how branching works, but let's take it at face value for a moment. At each branching point, you have a choice with two options that each lead to a new branch. This means that at every layer of choices, you double your amount of branches, and already at layer 3, you are running into diminishing returns. In this example, you have 8 unique story paths and no guarantee that the player will go back and play through the other 7, or in other words, you have a lot of writing work that most players might not even care about. This is why usually only a select number of choices actually lead to branching, and even then, these branches might merge back into the main path, like in this example, for example. Um, so it starts out the same and has some additional paths on each of the two initial branches, but all of these eventually merge back into the main path. There are a lot of different patterns like this, and if you haven't already, I highly recommend reading through this blog post by Sam Cabot-Ashwell that categorizes and explains some of the most common branching patterns. This one in particular is one he called branch and bottleneck because all branches eventually merge back together. Another common pattern that he lists in this post is the gauntlet. It also has a main path, but differs in that most branches lead into dead ends, either premature endings altogether or side branches that merge back into an earlier point in the story. This makes it quite clear to the player that there is a correct path, but doesn't necessarily render all others unimportant or boring. The knowledge that each choice could lead to an early end creates tension that makes its pattern exciting, even if the linearity of the main story isn't hidden. But what if you take it one step further? In a 2014 blog post, Nikki Case described something that they called broadening. It is a technique that essentially removes all branching but still keeps in choices. Instead of leading to distinct branches, choices are remembered by the game and lead to small changes and variations along the way that react to player choice without changing the overall structure. The goal of this is that the story feels broader than it really is. Or in Nikki Case's words, player choices should flavor the story instead of creating entirely separate branches. Now, you probably don't watch this talk to get rid of all your branches, but I think this is still an important technique to keep in mind because it also works well alongside more traditional branching. But before we get into some more practical examples, let's summarize the different kinds of choices that we've touched on so far. They basically fit into a neat hierarchy of how much they affect the structure of your game. At first, we have branching choices. In these, each option creates a new branch, so they tend to be used sparingly. Second, we have stat choices. Rather than branching directly, these choices influence stats in the background that then lead to branching at predetermined points in the game. And third, we have flavor choices. These have no effect on the branching, but that doesn't mean that they have no effect at all. Through techniques like the aforementioned broadening, they can lead to minor changes along the way, even if they don't change the overall structure. And their presence alone matters as well because the player doesn't know which choices are important and which aren't. Perceived depth is far more important than what your game actually looks like behind the scenes. So let's talk about what this looks like in practice. This is a detailed flowchart that we made during the development of our first game to do today. It shows each in-game day how scenes relate to each other and how they branch. If you put all of them one after another, it would follow a clear branch and bottleneck structure because every day starts at the same point and ends at more or less the same point. For all the complexity this implies, though, the actual branching of the game, if you don't count single scene variations, looks like this. There are only two paths in the game that significantly differ from the alternative, and even they merge back into the main path. The endings only split off from another at the very end, despite being based on the choices the player made along the way. And even in the endings, there are more granular variations depending on the choices. To do today's branching in general is so granular to the point that I'm tempted to call it broadening, since there are so few clearly distinct branches and instead lots of little variations. In contrast, here is the branching of our Yaoi Jam 27 game, Teach Me on a Guy, that we made in about a week and therefore had to simplify everything we could. Because we still wanted to try something interesting with its structure, it has one main path that is told from two different points of view. Which one you follow, you decide at the very beginning, and after that, it's the same story with three bad or joke endings each that can end the game prematurely. But if the branching isn't complex, how do you keep your story from feeling too linear? Well, to fill the gap in between actual branches, you can use mini variations. These are short branches of sorts that only last for a handful of lines before merging back into the main path. If you're working with RenPy, this is something that is actually already encouraged in the way the choice menus are written. This, for example, is the first choice in our game Brassica Merrytale. It has no major influence on the branching, and the difference between choice options only really lasts between 3 and 9 lines before the game continues the same way for all of them. The only purpose of this choice is to establish the three personality types the player can follow with the protagonist, Saffron, the three being lawful, daring, and soft. And as you can see here, really the differences are only within each of the choice options. But you're not limited to keeping the variations in these choice options. Later in the game, for example, there's a moment where the player can choose to faint. The game then checks the protagonist's stats, and depending on whether it makes sense for him to be able to feign on command, it either works or it doesn't. Again, these variations are short enough that I wouldn't call them separate branches, they simply add flavor and consequence to the player's choices. And you can add variations like this at any point in your story. All they need is some form of stat tracking that connects them to choices that happened earlier. If you reduce it even further, you have micro variations. These only really change a single line or even a single word. The purpose is to react to player choice with as little impact on scope as possible. So in this example, Prince Oat's line differs slightly depending on his affection stat. This has no great effect other than adding romantic undertones in case the player is currently on their way to his route, which is both for flavor and a subtle feedback to his currently more affection points. And yeah, it's really just a very simple conditional statement that checks the two affection stats of the two characters you can romance in this game. Or if you want to skip conditional statements altogether, there might be moments where you can change a line with the help of variables that get set in a previous choice. In this example, the only difference is really the name with no further change to the writing, but because everything around it is vague enough that it works with either name, it feels like it reacts to a choice you made earlier. There are, of course, downsides to this. The shorter a variation is, the easier it is to spot it in multiple playthroughs. If the story gets back to familiar territory after only a few new lines, the player gets a glimpse of the underlying structure and, at worst, is temporarily taken out of the experience. It can reveal that really this isn't an organic story that actually reacts to your choices, but rather one with hard limitations that it tries to hide. If taken to extreme, small variations like this can also make it harder to test your game, and they obfuscate the flow of the text when you look at it in the script. For example, again, in our first game to do today, there is little actual branching, but in the final in-game days, some scenes have conditional statements for almost all lines. If the script looks like this, it gets quite difficult to parse how the writing will actually appear to the player without checking it in-game. And checking it in-game isn't simple either, because you have to adjust all these different stats to check all possible combinations of lines. With the gift of hindsight, I would call this example an optimistic attempt at making the story react to player choices, while avoiding distinct branches that is ultimately too granular in its execution to fully make it worth it. So, if you want to use smaller variations, how should you go about tracking your stats? The easiest way to track choices is to simply add Boolean variables to them. Did Saffron go hunting? Did he collect firewood instead? A simple true or false state is usually enough to reference events from earlier in the story. And if you want, you can track every choice in your game or simply go back and add tracking when you realize you need it. This list here to the right is a list of all the variables that we track in the first two acts of Brassica, but they're not all choices that we have. So there are plenty of ones that don't really lead to consequences further down the line, but are simply there for flavor in the moment and to set the personality of the protagonist. For other types of stat tracking, you can think about the goals of your story. Which stats support them? Which makes sense to keep track of? Is it just the character's affection stats, or are there others that are important? And the reasons don't need to be deep. Asking the narrator in Brassica to make the game even gayer is really just a silly flavor choice, but the player will notice when you reference it later and feel like even inconsequential choices have some importance. So then you get to the question of how do you telegraph choices, and there are again many ways. In my experience, most VNs do so simply implicitly through the way choice options or the corresponding dialogue is written. So you don't exactly tell the player what a choice will lead to, but they can sort of guess from the way it's worded. But you can also explicitly tell the player, this choice will affect this stat. The more complex your stats are, the more it actually helps the player to be upfront about it. Kristen Laugh's Lady Killer in a Bind tells you exactly how choices affect stats, which choices will end the scene, and which choices will unlock further choices. They even tell you the tone of any given choice, and still it doesn't take away from the tension because each choice is a deliberation of what it might be the best at any given moment. Or you could just not telegraph it at all. If discovery or a sense of disorientation are important in your story, or there simply isn't much meaning to a choice, you can just let the player figure it out on their own, and that might be the best option. The next step from tracking choices is to make even the protagonist's personality dependent on them. In games where the protagonist has dynamic personality, all choices need to either affect or check the personality of your protagonist. How exactly this happens is different depending on what kind of dynamic personality you want. So, for example, with a blank slate protagonist, the possible personality types might differ greatly in each choice, but to stay consistent, there might also come a point where you need to lock away certain choices that don't align with the personality the player has nurtured. If you only differentiate between nuances that are all canon to your protagonist, all the player does is decide which ones are more pronounced, and as a result, you'll likely check which one is the strongest at any given moment, but you could also check how defined the others are whenever it makes sense. So, if there's a tie, what do you do then? In Brassica, we decided that in the case of a tie, Saffron's daring personality will be weighted the most, while the soft personality will be weighted more than the lawful one. This is simply because soft automatically takes a backseat to daring in most situations, and the soft variations are usually funnier than the lawful ones. So just think about what makes sense for your story and what will be the most enjoyable for the player. Finally, let's talk a bit about how to plan your stats and subsequently your choices. I find it the easiest to start with the endings and work backwards. So how many endings will you have? How do they differ? Are some of the first questions you can ask. Will there be distinct branches leading up to them? Will there be branches at all? Just by answering these questions, you should already have a good idea of which stats you will need in order to get there. In my experience, having fewer stats is better since it simplifies things both for you and for the player. Whether you start with your plot and derive the stats from that, or start with your themes is also up to you. Either approach is fine, and which one you choose can just depend on your workflow and the specifics of your project. And finally, how many opportunities will the player have to raise certain stats? Will all choices affect them, or only a few? This all plays into the overall structure of your game and basically the branching with that. So, unless you land on a Boolean only approach to stat tracking, you will sooner or later have to work with the numbers directly. In practice, this means deciding how you want to count your stats. Only adding to stats makes it easy to keep track of how choices will decide the branching along the way, and only subtracting is functionally the same. If you do both, keeping the potential progression of a stat in mind gets more complex, but exposing the player exposing to the player that the choices can have both positive and negative effects adds another layer of tension to each choice. Regardless of that, if you have at least two stats that decide your branching, avoiding ties becomes important. Simply making sure that you have an uneven number of choices before a branching point is the easiest way to avoid a tie, but it won't necessarily work once you handle three or more stats. Another way is to include choices that add or subtract a higher number than regular choices shortly before a branching point. But ultimately, you'll just have to do the math. And that shouldn't be hard. If keeping track of your stats is difficult for you, this likely means that they are too complex for the player, and it's worth considering if you can simplify them. So, that was a lot of ones, but what does that all boil down to? Well, in the end, everything heavily depends on your project and what kind of story you want to tell with it. None of these techniques or rules should be taken too seriously. Think about the reasons behind them and then break the rules whenever it makes sense. The perception of the player, the perception the player has of your story, your choices and your branching is far more important than what it actually looks like behind the scenes. And really, small changes add up. A story with no distinct branching can still feel more dynamic simply because it has more choices with consequences. How significant they are to the big picture of the story doesn't really matter. There is no right or wrong way to approach branching. But I hope that some of these concepts and techniques will help you tell stories that don't need huge differences to feel dynamic. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you could take away something from this. And if you have any questions or thoughts, I believe we have 5 minutes of Q&A, but you can also just contact me and I'll do my best to answer. So thank you again.
All right. Thanks for the great talk. Right, I'm going to try to read questions and then do my best. Okay, so Mal has a question here. Do you have any advice for using stat-based branches in non-linear games? It seems very easy to end up with stat caps being hit too soon in some paths because others have been played first, which can be negatively affect pacing. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so planning out stats and working with caps is definitely tricky. So we have so far often avoided issues by just having two stats that we focus on. But if you have more, I'd say just try to see where a bottleneck might be, so where you might run into issues with it, and then force the player into certain choices or branches that just drive up a certain stat or another, so that you minimize the chance that you run into ties or into situations where it's unclear what stat is really the deciding one right now. I hope that makes sense.
Cool. Okay. So, and one person's Reverie is asking, can you give an example of broadening and how you might do that in a real story scenario?
Yeah, so I I think there might be something in one of the examples here already. So yeah, in this one, for example, this is a little hard to parse, but basically this is the scene where the protagonist wakes up the day after deciding which character to romance, and the character that they could have rejected is the one who greets them. So there are a lot of small differences in how they talk to the protagonist, depending on whether there even was a confession scene or and whether they were then rejected in the scene. So as you can see, this is just single or two lines that change every time this is checked, but it completely changes the tone of the scene. So even just changing the expression for a certain line, it's a small change that can change the feel of the game without having to be a distinct branch.
Cool. And then related to this, someone's asking, how does broadening apply to different routes?
I would say it doesn't really matter that much if it's on a specific route or not, because you can just treat it the same. So if you split into a route in the middle of the game and then don't return from it at all, then you can just treat it from there on as you did from the beginning. So there are choices on that route that don't lead into distinct branches, but still get referenced later on, and that make the game feel broader than the route actually is.
Cool. All right. Any more questions? We have a couple of more minutes left, so we can probably do about one or two more. Let's see what people are doing in the chat. Several people are typing. Okay, so there's one here. So do you think that broadening is better applied to shorter VNs with less branching as opposed to longer ones with multiple branches? Because it's more likely that the broadening will be noticed in shorter works and players are less likely to replay longer branches to find broadening opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. So this is we're basically still on the perfect slide for that because that is exactly what happened in To Do today. It's quite a long, well, it's not long by VN standards, but it's about 80,000 words long. And not having distinct branches meant that the broadening really adds up, and you have all these small variations at the end that get hard to keep track of, and that the player likely won't even notice because they're not going to replay it often enough to see all these differences. So definitely broadening is a good way to make shorter games more dynamic, while branching is still really helpful to uh, handle longer ones.
Cool. And then one person had a question. Do you chart everything out with the stats and such before writing as you write, or do you go back and add it once you write what you want to happen?
I usually plan out the overall branching, but for smaller choices, I do it as I write. So I find that it helps to make the story feel just more organic if you just add stat tracking or references to earlier events when it feels appropriate, rather than planning everything out from the get-go.
And then there's another question. Any advice on how to more effectively slide back a side branch into a main branch, i.e., a conversation that can play out with very different endings that still lead into the same next scene?
Yeah, that one's tricky as well. So, I'm trying to think of an example, but I think the main thing to keep in mind is really that these transitions can pretty much be whatever you need at the moment. So, there were some in Brassica that are just single lines again, because the overall tone of the scene wasn't different enough to need a long transition. But if there's different endings to a scene that are very different, then it might be sensible to just add like a mini scene to kind of center everything again and then move on to the part that all the different variations have in common again.
Awesome. Okay. So we are at time. Diego, thank you so much for speaking. I know there's a lot of deep questions that go on with this, so feel free to connect in chat, keep going on having your conversations there. Meanwhile, Diego, I think you're
Yes.
up.
Yeah.
All right.
Hi.
So,
Hello.
yep. All right.
Let me share my screen. Okay. So, okay.
Cool.
Let me put.
Yep, I see your slides. It's all yours.
Yeah.